Hello everyone, I hope you all had great spring breaks, and this week's primary source lecture is going to be about two women in different classes. This presentation was put together by Cheyenne Wallace, Anna Laufman, and me, Grace Iverson. And so we thought we'd kick it off with a quote from Pearl S. Buck. The quote is, "The truth has never been told about women in history. That everywhere man has gone, women has gone too. And what he has done, she has done also. Women are ignorant of their own past and ignorant of their own importance in that past." And I'd like you all to keep this in mind as I continue on with this presentation. Then just remember that women were involved just as much as men were in the American Revolutionary era. Throughout history, unfortunately, women have rarely been shown in history books despite making up half of the population, and when they have been represented in those books, they have been seen as weak, inferior, not as smart, or just as common housewives. They rarely are depicted having lives outside of the four walls of their own homes. However, there have been many documents written by women over time in history, and these include diaries, autobiographies, and news articles. And now it is important to look at both aspects to have a stronger understanding of true historical events. If we're looking at history just by what the men experienced, we're only getting about 50% of what actually happened, and that's just not right. All right, and one of the diaries we looked at this week was by Elizabeth Drinker, and her husband referred to her as a woman of the best sort. Now, Elizabeth Drinker was very well educated. She was a wealthy Quaker woman. She was raised with strong Quaker beliefs, modest financial resources, and a moderate capacity to earn money in a society where women's employment opportunities were limited. Now, her parents died when she was just 21, but because of the way she was raised and her education and helping out her family with businesses in the past, she was able to go on and make a sort of a living for herself in the feather trade for a little while before she met her husband. And she was very well educated. She was a voracious reader. However, despite all of this, she did not support female education, and she believed that she had a dull brain. And so even though she was very well educated and very smart, she always believed that she was inferior to men. When she was 26, she married a property merchant named Henry Drinker, and from her accounts, it was a very happy union. She loved Henry very much, and together they were in the top 5% wealthiest taxpayers in Philadelphia. So they were very, very wealthy, very well off, and they remained in that top 5% throughout their lives. And now Elizabeth spent her days reading and raising her children, as well as housing her servants and various orphans. Because the Drinkers were well off in society, they were known in the community as someone you can go to if you need food or employment or maybe a little bit of money. They were very kind and very supportive of their community and really did what they could to help anyone else who was down and out. Politically, she was a loyalist who was suspicious of the American revolutionaries and disagreed with the entire notion of feminism. Now, Elizabeth and Henry were strong Quakers, and because of their Quaker belief, they did not support the war effort, and they refused to sign a loyalty oath to the new government, and also didn't want to pay taxes. This was a very common occurrence in the Quaker population because of their staunch pacifist beliefs. And so because of this, Henry was actually imprisoned in Lancaster for possible seditious acts. And Elizabeth would not stand for this, and she and two other women who both had their husbands taken prisoner as well, they drew up a plea and they went to George Washington himself to release their Quakers. And they held a meeting with him and they were given a written pass to the headquarters where they were reacquainted with their husbands. So Elizabeth is a very interesting character in that she's full of contradictions. She was very well educated but didn't support education for other women. She was very independent but relied on her husband for monetary gain. And she kept her journal throughout her life, and she's just a really interesting character to study. Now, the other diary we looked into was written by Anne Baker Carson, who was a working woman. She was actually fairly well educated and independent. She grew up with an alcoholic father and a very hardworking mother who believed it was best to put her through school. And just by the she was 15, she was married to a ship captain who was 40 years old, so 25 years older than her. He was the same age. He served in the Navy with her father. And she was married off along with her older sister to be less of a burden on her parents' finances. Now, Anne Baker Carson lived just above the average Philadelphian household. She wasn't poor, but they also weren't super rich. Because her husband was a sea captain, she was often abandoned for months at a time while he was off working. And because of this, she had to start finding her own way. She started her own businesses with her family as extra means of income. She ran a china shop, her sister started a small school, and her mother took in boarders, and all women learned to sew on the side as well and took up jobs as seamstresses. So women's occupation during this time was very interesting. Only a few occupations held by women were deemed as positive economic contributions and were ever recorded. These include independent retailers, providers of services, and producers of apparel. And most jobs were seen as a woman's duty, which were like domestic servants, wet nurses, laundresses, spinsters, and seamstresses, and market women. And then there were the lesser desired occupations, such as barmaids and prostitutes. And only two of Anne's four businesses were ever actually recorded. And so history wrongly portrays women as having one occupation, if any. They're mostly seen as housewives, or like maybe they're just a seamstress, but they actually held a lot of different odd jobs to help make ends meet within their family. Now, one of the biggest differences between Elizabeth Drinker and Anne Baker Carson was wealth and their status. And so we can see in women during this time period that elite women would be able to spend the majority of their time at ease. They could read books or hold luncheons or have other hobbies. They did raise their children, but they also had the help of servants to do that. And they helped orphans and other members of their community and managed the servants that worked in their house. They had less financial stress, and they did not really have a need to pick up odd jobs to help make ends meet. Whereas working class women spent the majority of their time helping with family tasks, raising children. They unwillingly married older men who often would abandon them and force them to take up occupations to get by. And working class women also saw much more sickness than women in the elite circles. And now, to further broaden our understanding of women during this time period outside of just the two diaries, we turn to Benjamin Franklin. And when Benjamin Franklin was a teenager, he wrote letters to a newspaper impersonating a woman named Silence Dogood. And his letter number 5 portrays an antagonist that he creates which allows him to essentially argue with his own gender. And this is an excerpt from the 5th Silence Dogood letter. I think it will be best to produce my antagonist before I encounter him. To Mrs. Dogood. Madam, my design in troubling you with this letter is, to desire you would begin with your own sex first. Let the first volley of your resentments be directed against female vice. Let female idleness, ignorance, and folly, which are vices more peculiar to your sex than to ours, be the subject of your satires, but more especially female pride, which I think is intolerable. And I just think that's an interesting passage to try to analyze and figure out what Benjamin Franklin was actually trying to get at here. And throughout the letters that he wrote in his teenage years, he shares social issues with both genders during this time. It's an interesting viewpoint of a man impersonating a woman to talk about gender issues. And these letters did allow for a new definition of womanhood to grow. And women were represented in early American press. One thing that was common was their value was held in household labor. Another quote from our man Benjamin Franklin from Poor Richard Improved. Housewifery is woman's noblest fame, which just goes to show that their value truly was within the home, and they did not need a job outside of housewifery because it was so noble and right. Women faced double standards even back in that time. This was a response that Celia Single wrote to the Pennsylvania Gazette. I have several times in your paper seen severe reflection upon us women for idleness and extravagance, but I do not remember to have once seen any such admissions among the men. So even back in those days, she could see like the double standards that could arise between women being critiqued for doing the same things that men do. There's also a fair amount of objectification. This again comes from Ben Franklin, and this is from the Old Mistress Apologue. And this is just a shortened I shortened an excerpt of the whole thing. It was like 8 points. It was very long, so I shortened it down. I repeat my former advice, that in all your amours you should prefer old women to young ones. You call this a paradox and demand my reasons. They are these. When women cease to be handsome, they study to be good. The face first grows lank and wrinkled, then the neck, then the breast and arms, the lower parts continuing to the last as plump as ever, so that covering all with a basket, and regarding only what is below the girdle, it is impossible of 2 women to know an old one from a young one. And choose older women because the sin is less. The debauching of a virgin may be her ruin and make her life unhappy. And I don't know about you guys, but like just me as a woman reading these, it doesn't make me feel super great. And so our discussion questions, we have 2 of them for this week. The first one is, if you were to live during the Revolutionary Era, would you have fought for more liberties? If so, what wouldn't you have fought for? The second question we have, what role do women have in understanding history? Should we as historians try to learn more about their contributions, or are their influences just not significant enough outside of the home for us to understand? And that is it. See you all in the discussion forums.